Hello and welcome to video 3. In this video, we're going to talk about executive functioning. And this is one of those things that once I really started to understand what it was and how it related to behavior, so many things really started to fall into place. And that was applicable not only for my relationship with my autistic daughter, but now with my youngest daughter. So in case you missed them, video 1 was just the introduction video to share a little bit more about my story and why I did this video series. Video 2 is to introduce you to the topic of emotional regulation and emotional recognition. And now in video 3, we're going to talk about executive functioning. And you'll have to forgive me if I start geeking out a little bit about this stuff because it's so much that goes on in the brain, and I love stuff that's going on in the brain. So let's get started. The term executive functioning was actually introduced in the 1970s by Carl Pribram, whose research indicated that the executive functions are mediated in the prefrontal cortex. So that's about like right around this side of the brain. And there are 4 circuits that predominantly have to do with executive functioning and executive functioning deficits. So to further define that though, executive functioning skills are a set of 8 interrelated cognitive operations, which is just a fancy way of saying stuff that goes on in your brain, that are controlled by the frontal lobes, so all the stuff before from the brain, and they are responsible for goal-directing and problem-solving behaviors. So the frontal lobe, again, is that front part of the brain, and then you have the side, the parietal lobes, and then the temporal lobes, and the occipital lobes, and then the cerebellum, which is at the back. And the frontal lobes are the most recent addition to the human brain, and they're about 33% of the entire cerebral cortex. So the function of the frontal lobes is often compared to the function of an orchestra conductor. So that's what keeps all of your pieces of the brain and all of the things that are going on in your brain. That's what helps coordinate it all and make it work together. I told you I already apologize for this. I love this kind of stuff, so I might start getting a little bit geeky about these things. It's just, I find it fascinating. And that was just the other thing when it came to my autistic daughter. Because autism is a neurological disorder, learning more about the brain and how it functions was so key in changing my relationship with her. So the last part of the brain to mature is actually the frontal lobe. But when you factor in this thing called neuroplasticity, the brain really never stops developing. But what is neuroplasticity, and what does it have to do with executive functioning? Neuroplasticity, which is a term used by neuroscientists, is the ability to structure and function brain changes based on experience. So experience for the nervous system, which is, what the brain controls, involves the activation of neurons firing in response to a stimulus, and when those neurons become active, their connections to each other grow and supportive cells grow. So this is how experience shapes the neural structure of the brain. So with all of that out of the way, when we are talking about executive functioning deficits, we are concerned with 4 major circuits. The first circuit that we're going to talk about is called the what circuit, and that goes from the frontal lobe to an area of the brain called the basal ganglia. And the what circuit is linked to our working memory. Now, if you recall what we talked about in the video on emotional recognition and regulation, working memory is an area of difficulty for individuals on the autism spectrum. Working memory helps us with self-regulation and with emotional regulation because it's based on how we have dealt with these things in the past. The next circuit we're going to talk about is called the when circuit, and this one is again at the front of the brain, and our when circuit is our timing circuit. So this is why people might have difficulties with time management and with procrastination. So it coordinates how smooth the behavior is going to be, the sequence of the behavior, and then the timeline of the actions that follow. The third circuit, which again is in the frontal cortex, is called our Y circuit, and this is the circuit that propels us into action based on our emotions. So it's where what we are thinking controls how we feel, and how we feel controls what we think. So this is that final place where all of our plans are made. So when we have multiple things that we're thinking about, the Y circuit is where we ultimately decide what we are going to do. And now finally there's the Who circuit, and this one is, again, starts in the frontal lobe and then it goes to the very back of the brain hemisphere. So this is where our self-awareness takes place, which is why it's called the Who circuit. So this is how we feel about ourselves, both internally and externally, and to what's going on around us. So this would make sense, you know? Depending on which circuits are most impaired and least impaired, you begin to see the variations in any kind of symptoms that someone's going to have. So some people might have more working memory deficits, some people have more emotional regulation problems, and some have more difficulties with the timing of their emotional responses. Because executive functioning and executive functioning deficits are so closely tied to our brain, and because autism is a neurological disorder, so many individuals on the autism spectrum struggle with multiple executive functioning difficulties or deficits. So executive functioning, again, these are the cognitive operations, just a fancy way for saying what's going on in our brain, that consist of the capacity to inhibit or resist impulses. So these impulses also have to do with our ability to regulate emotional responses. In addition, executive functioning includes the capacity to initiate or begin a task, to hold information in your mind for later use, which is a working memory, and to manage current and future-oriented task demands. So there's so much that goes on with executive functioning, but for our purposes and how it relates in particular to behavior, we want to look at those ones that have to do with our emotional responses, our self-regulation abilities, and then our abilities for the task memory. So Stephen Pfeiffer, who was a prominent school neuropsychologist, suggested that executive functioning could also be thought of as a set of multiple cognitive processes that act in a coordinated way to direct cognition, emotion, and motor functions. So again, think about this as autism is a neurological disorder and executive functions are neurological processes. When we have those executive functioning deficits that then interfere with how these functions are supposed to happen, no wonder our kids on the autism spectrum are having such difficulty. So through the years, executive functioning difficulties might look a little bit like this. For a preschooler, they are easily frustrated and they have trouble following directions. They have frequent tantrums over seemingly little things. For kids in the elementary school age, they start on one task and then they get distracted because they're so focused on the least important thing that you say. They panic when their rules and routines are challenged. For kids in middle school, those are our tweens, they have difficulties starting big assignments and focus on less important details first, so then they are frequently getting upset about small things. Excuse me. And then for high schoolers and adults, they lose track of time, and they are often still in the middle of something because they are focusing on those small things. And they tend to be a little bit more impulsive and engage in risky behavior. So when we look at this further, executive skills, the response inhibition, that is the capacity to think before you act. So that is where that impulse control comes in. Working memory is the ability to hold in the information in the memory while you're performing complex tasks. If you have deficits in working memory, you're going to struggle because you can't connect all of these pieces together. With emotional control and the emotional regulation, we want to be able to successfully manage and control our emotions in order to complete tasks properly and to control and direct our behavior in a productive way. But when this is inhibited because of the lack of the executive functioning ability, the behavior then as we talked about in the emotional regulation, it dominates your child's ability to really think about things. Another one that our kids on the autism spectrum struggle with is called the sustained attention, and that looks like the fidgety kid who just can't sit still, who has the attention span of a gnat. And then there are kids who struggle with the task initiation, which is the ability to begin the projects in an efficient and timely manner. Other ways that executive functioning difficulties present is through planning and prioritization. So that's being able to say, well, this needs to get done first, so I can't do this until I can't do these other things until this most important thing is done first. And then there's the organization piece, which, that's just getting all of our information together. And time management, which is the capacity to estimate the time that you really have and how to use it and how to effectively use it. Another thing is our flexibility, which, with our kids on the spectrum, they struggle so much with increasing their flexibility and increasing things, which is why we say those routines and structure is so important for them, because it helps them increase their flexibility within those existing routines. And then finally, our kids with these executive functioning difficulties also have problems with the metacognition, which is the ability to take a step back and look at the big picture and then be able to say, how am I doing with this situation? What can I be doing better with this situation? So you look at all of these areas that executive functioning really affects, and then it starts to make so much more sense as to why our kids on the autism spectrum struggle with some things that just seem so simple. And it wasn't until I really understood just how much went on with executive functioning that I started to make that big mindset shift in approaching my daughter's behavior, and not just her behavior, but also approaching just my parenting with her in general. And learning about the executive functioning stuff also started to teach me a lot about myself and the areas that I struggled. So executive functioning weaknesses at home might look like that child who has the constantly messy room, who just can't keep things together, who is always forgetting things. And it might not just be because, you assume that they're a slob, but that they truly are struggling with keeping things in order because they don't know how to process it properly. And when it comes to that, we want to make sure that we are intervening at their level. Ultimately, our goal is to be able to help our kids develop their own executive functioning skills so they can function independently. So we want to teach them the skill and then motivate our child to use this specific skill. So for example, if you are trying to help a child learn how to control their temper, you're going to make a list of things that happen that trigger their temper. And then you're going to work on things to manage or eliminate the triggers for their temper. So you're going to talk about what losing their temper looks like or sounds like. So that ties back into our emotional recognition piece, where we are talking about the multiple ways that you can express anger and all of the words that you can use for anger. Not just saying that I'm angry, but I'm upset, or that, I'm so frustrated, or I'm so this and I'm so that. And then you also want to get them to talk to you about what it sounds like. So if they're yelling, or if they're throwing things, or they're kicking things. And then you pick the ones that need to go on a can't do list. This list needs to be short, and you only want to work on 1 to 2 of them at a time. That goes back to our emotional regulation rules. 3 to 4 at a time for the rules, and then if you're working on these things with executive functioning, 1 to 2. Now, you're going to make a list of things that your child can do instead of those can't do behaviors, and these are your replacement behaviors. So you want to offer them at least twice as many alternatives that they can do. And then you're going to put those things on what we call a hard times board. So when your child is having a hard time because of this emotion, these are the things that they can pull in to help them better process the situation and what's going on around them. So, for example, you want to say to your child, when you are upset, what strategy do you want to use? You offer them those choices, and then when they pick one of those choices, you reward them for making the right choice. This is the positive reinforcement that I think so many of us really miss because we're not reinforcing the right thing. And sometimes it's just so easy to give in and just reinforce that negative behavior instead of reinforcing the positive behaviors. So we need to not only address the trigger and address the negative behavior, but we need to find alternatives to those behaviors and then teach our child how to access them and how to use them. And the main thing here to remember is that you need to be patient with your child, especially with our kids on the autism spectrum who have such difficulties with the working memory, because for them it requires breaking things down in more steps. It might require more repetition, and of course on your part it's going to require so much consistency. You need to be just as dedicated to helping your child learn these new skills and implement these skills as your child is, if not more so. Because if it looks like your child is so frustrated that they want to give up, and they see you at the brink of frustration and wanting to give up, your child is going to want to give up so much sooner. So I hope you enjoyed the information here in this video on executive functioning. This was one of my favorite things to learn about, and it's one of those things that I'm having so much fun learning about and implementing and developing the strategies and developing the systems and developing the tips. So between this and then the emotional regulation, those were the two biggest keys and the two biggest changes of areas that I had to start making my changes and pulling together the research and pulling together all the tips in order to really transform and revolutionize my relationship with my daughter, to restore this kind of joy and reduce the overwhelm. And those things are all in my system. It took me a lot of time, and I won't say that it was always easy to do. There were plenty of frustrating moments, but we got through it. And in the next video, we're going to talk all about how behavior and your approach to behavior then in turn affects your parenting and your relationship with your child. So I will see you in that video, and I hope you have a great day.